What would you do if the woman you loved asked you to make an impossible promise on her deathbed? And what if, months later, fate arrived at your door in the form of someone who looked exactly like her, carrying a secret that would shatter everything you thought you knew? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The truck bed held nothing but rust and regret. Marcus Webb sat behind the wheel of his 1987 Chevy, parked on the shoulder of Highway 41, watching the Nebraska landscape stretch flat and endless before him. 3 months. It had been 3 months since Sarah died, and the world still felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for him to break. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. Sarah's voice still lived in his head, not as a memory anymore, but as a constant, unbearable presence. Promise me, Marcus. Promise me you won't try to replace me. Don't marry again. Don't do that to yourself. Don't do that to our life together. He'd held her hand in that hospital room, machines beeping their mechanical funeral song around them. Cancer had hollowed her out from the inside, left her skin papery, her eyes too large for her face, and all she could think about was him, about his future, about protecting him from the very thing she was leaving him to face alone. "I promise," he'd whispered. "I swear it, Sarah. I won't." It was the easiest promise he'd ever made, because keeping it felt impossible. How could he even think about another woman when Sarah's coffee mug still sat on the kitchen counter, when her wedding ring was still on his nightstand because he couldn't bring himself to put it away? Marcus started the truck. The engine coughed to life, reluctant as an old man rising from bed. He had nowhere to be. That was the problem with grief. It didn't schedule appointments. It just showed up, uninvited, at 3 in the morning, at the grocery store when he saw someone with Sarah's laugh, at the mailbox when bills arrived, addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Webb. The ranch was 15 miles outside of Millbrook, a small town that nobody drove through unless they had to. Marcus had inherited the property from his father 5 years ago, 30 acres of pasture, a barn that needed constant repair, and a house that echoed now in a way it never had before. When Sarah was alive, that echo had felt full. Now it felt like proof of absence. He pulled down the gravel drive at dusk. The sky was bleeding orange and purple, the kind of sunset Sarah used to stop whatever she was doing to watch. He didn't look at it. The house needed paint. He'd been meaning to do it for months. The porch sagged slightly on the left side, and one of the shutters hung crooked. Everything on the property had the look of something slowly giving up. Marcus understood the feeling. He climbed the porch steps, unlocked the door, and stepped into the quiet. The living room smelled like dust and the ghost of Sarah's lavender candles. He'd stopped lighting them weeks ago. The smell hurt too much. The refrigerator hummed emptily in the kitchen. Marcus opened a can of beans, ate them cold, standing at the counter, staring out the window at the darkening fields. It was a Tuesday, or maybe a Wednesday. Days had started to blur together into one long, grey Tuesday. He was rinsing the can when headlights swept across the window. Visitors were rare at the Webb Ranch, rarer still at 9 in the evening. Marcus turned off the water, listening. A car door slammed, then another, footsteps on gravel, hesitant, like whoever was out there wasn't sure they were in the right place. Marcus dried his hands on a dish towel, one of Sarah's favorites, embroidered with tiny blue flowers, and walked to the front door. What he saw stopped his breath. A woman stood on his porch, silhouetted by the porch light. She was tall, with dark hair that fell past her shoulders, and she was holding something wrapped in a blue blanket against her chest. For a moment, just a moment, Marcus's heart performed a trick. It stopped. Then it tried to beat its way out of his ribs. The woman looked exactly like Sarah, not similar, not reminiscent, exactly like her. The same sharp cheekbones, the same way she tilted her head slightly to one side, the same curve of her mouth. It was impossible. It was a hallucination. It was... "Are you Marcus Webb?" the woman asked, and her voice was different from Sarah's. Softer somehow, uncertain. Marcus couldn't finish the sentence. His mind was doing backflips, trying to catch up to reality. "My name is Rachel Hartwell," the woman said. She shifted the bundle in her arms, and Marcus could see now that it was a baby. An infant, probably only a few weeks old. "I know this is going to sound strange. I know you don't know me, but I'm Sarah's sister." The world tilted. "That's not possible," Marcus heard himself say. "Sarah didn't have a sister." Rachel's face tightened. She looked down at the baby, then back at Marcus. "She did. She had me. I'm her twin sister, identical twins, obviously. We were separated at birth. Our adoptive parents never told her about me, and mine never told me about her until—" She broke off, swallowed hard. "Until I saw her obituary online last month, and I realized I had a sister I never got to meet." Marcus gripped the door frame. His knuckles were shaking. "You're lying." "I'm not," Rachel said quietly. "I have documentation, DNA tests, everything. I drove here from Colorado because I needed to understand who she was, who I was, by proxy. And then I realized." She looked down at the baby again. "I realized I didn't have anywhere else to go." "What do you mean, nowhere else to go?" Marcus asked, though part of him already knew. Part of him could see where this was headed, and he wanted to run from it the way a man runs from fire. "The father," Rachel said, and there was a tremor in her voice now. "He left when he found out I was pregnant. My family threw me out. I've been staying at a motel in Millbrook for 3 days, trying to figure out what to do. A woman at the diner told me where to find you. She said you owned this ranch, that you were—" Rachel paused, choosing her words carefully. "That you were Sarah's husband." Marcus felt the house shift beneath him, or maybe he was the one shifting. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" Rachel reached into her jacket pocket slowly, as though she was afraid any sudden movement might spook him. She pulled out a folder, worn at the edges. "Birth certificates, adoption papers, DNA results from a lab in Denver. Everything's here." Marcus took the folder with hands that didn't feel like they belonged to him. He opened it. Birth certificates showing Rachel Hartwell and Sarah Webb, born on the same day, 32 years ago, to the same biological mother. Adoption papers, signed and notarized. A DNA test result showing a genetic match of 99.7%. It was true, impossible, but true. "I didn't know about her," Rachel said softly. "Not until I was 28 years old. By the time I found her, she was already sick. I tried to reach out, but the email bounced back. By the time I got a phone number, she was too weak to talk. And then—" Rachel's voice broke. "And then she was gone. I never got to meet her. Never got to tell her that I existed." Marcus looked at Rachel's face, Sarah's face, but not. The features were the same, but the expression was different. Sarah had always carried a kind of certainty, a confidence that came from knowing who she was and where she belonged. Rachel's face held something else: desperation, exhaustion, the look of someone who had been running and had finally stopped, not because she'd reached her destination, but because she couldn't run anymore. "What's the baby's name?" Marcus asked. "Emma," Rachel said. "She's 6 weeks old." Marcus looked down at the infant, wrapped in the blue blanket. Her eyes were closed, her tiny fist curled against her mouth. She looked impossibly small and impossibly fragile, like something that could break if you breathed too hard on it. "I'm sorry," Rachel said. "I know this is overwhelming. I know I have no right to show up on your doorstep. But I had nowhere else to go. And I saw her obituary and I thought maybe you could tell me about her, maybe you could help me understand who she was, who I am, and maybe—" Rachel's voice became even smaller. "Maybe you could let us stay for a few days, just until I figure out what to do next." Marcus should have said no. He should have closed the door and gone back to his beans and his grief and his promise to a dead woman. He should have driven Rachel and Emma back to Millbrook and directed them to the nearest shelter. Instead, he heard himself say, "Come inside, it's cold." And as Rachel stepped through the doorway, carrying Sarah's ghost in the tom, the form of her sister, Marcus felt the promise he'd made begin to crack. Not because he was thinking about breaking it, but because the universe had apparently decided that promises meant nothing in the face of what came next. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The guest room hadn't been opened in over a year. Marcus had to jiggle the handle twice before the door swung inward, releasing a breath of stale air that smelled of forgotten things. Rachel stood in the hallway behind him, Emma now awake and beginning to fuss against her shoulder, small mewing sounds that cut through the silence like a kitten's cry. "It's not much," Marcus said, stepping inside. Dust motes hung in the beam of his flashlight. A twin bed, pushed against the far wall, held a folded quilt that Sarah had made years ago, before they were married. A dresser stood empty, its mirror reflecting nothing but shadows. A small window overlooked the back pasture where the fences needed mending. "It's perfect," Rachel said, though her voice wavered slightly. "It's more than I had yesterday." Marcus turned on the overhead light. A bare bulb flickered to life, harsh and revealing. The room looked even smaller now, more pitiful somehow. He'd never noticed how depressing it was until someone actually had to live in it. "There's a bathroom through that door. Clean towels in the cabinet. The shower can be temperamental. You have to turn the handle all the way to the left first." "Thank you," Rachel said. She was swaying slightly, Marcus noticed, the kind of subtle movement that came from exhaustion so complete that your body forgot how to stay still. Emma had stopped mewing and was now making small snuffling sounds, searching for something to eat. "She hungry?" Marcus asked. "Always," Rachel said with a tired smile. "Babies are basically tiny eating machines, wrapped in desperation and bodily fluids." She paused, as if she'd said something too honest. "Sorry, I'm probably oversharing. I haven't had a real conversation with another adult in weeks." Marcus found himself almost smiling. It was an odd thing to do, smiling. It felt foreign, like moving a muscle he'd forgotten how to use. "There's formula in the kitchen. I bought some when he trailed off. When he what? When he started thinking about his wife's ghost showing up at his door. When he decided to let a stranger live in his house. I'll grab it," he finished. Downstairs, the kitchen felt smaller with Rachel and Emma in the house. Marcus retrieved a bottle of infant formula from the cabinet. He'd purchased it on impulse a week ago, never quite sure why, and heated water in a kettle. His hands moved through the familiar motions of bottle preparation, something he'd never done before but seemed to know how to do anyway. Sarah had wanted children. They'd talked about it so many times, mapping out a future that would never arrive. He'd learned how to make bottles from YouTube videos, lying in bed at 2 in the morning, preparing for a life that would never exist. When he returned upstairs, Rachel had changed into fresh clothes, a t-shirt and jeans that hung loose on her frame. She looked even more like Sarah now, dressed down, without makeup, her hair pulled into a messy bun. It was disconcerting, like watching a ghost that could talk back. "Here," he said, handing her the bottle. Rachel took it gratefully. Emma latched onto the nipple immediately, her eyes closing in concentration. For a moment, Rachel just stood there holding the baby, and Marcus saw something shift in her face. Relief, release. The expression of someone who'd been holding their breath for so long they'd almost forgotten how to breathe. "How long have you been on your own?" Marcus asked. Rachel didn't answer immediately. She moved to sit on the edge of the bed, Emma cradled in her lap, the bottle steady in her hand. "Since I found out I was pregnant," she said finally. 3 months before Emma was born. My ex-boyfriend Derek, he wanted nothing to do with it. And my parents." She paused, swallowing hard. "My parents said I was a disappointment, that I'd thrown away my life. My mother didn't come to the hospital when Emma was born." "That's rough," Marcus said. And he meant it. He couldn't imagine Sarah's parents being that way. Sarah's mother had passed 5 years before her father lived in Arizona and called every Sunday. He'd called after Sarah died, his voice hollow through the phone line. "I never thought I'd bury my daughter," he'd said. "I always thought I'd go first. I worked at a marketing firm in Denver," Rachel continued. "Good job, decent salary. But they let me go 2 weeks before my due date. Said I could come back after maternity leave, but when I called, they'd already filled my position. No references, no severance, nothing. I burned through my savings paying for the hospital, and then—" She looked down at Emma, who was drinking steadily, utterly content. "And then I found out about Sarah." "How did you find out?" Marcus asked. It was a strange question, but he needed to understand this. Needed to know if this woman really was who she claimed to be, or if this was some elaborate con. Not that it mattered anymore. She was here. She was in his guest room. The decision had been made. "Like I said, I hired a private investigator. My adoptive parents had always been vague about my history, said they didn't have much information. But I always wondered, you know, who my biological mother was, why she gave me up. I saved up for years to pay for the search." Rachel shifted Emma to her other shoulder, patting her back gently. "The investigator found records of my adoption, tracked down my biological mother, who passed away 15 years ago, and found records of my twin. There were newspaper announcements about your wedding, about Sarah's promotion at the library. Even her obituary came up when I searched her name." "And you just decided to show up?" Marcus asked. There was an edge to his voice now, something sharp and accusatory. He wasn't sure where it was coming from. Maybe it was easier to be angry than to process the fact that Sarah had a twin sister he'd never known about. "I tried to call first," Rachel said quietly. "I found your number through the county records. But I was so nervous, I hung up. Twice. The third time," a woman answered. She sounded weak. She asked who was calling. I couldn't tell her. I just hung up. Marcus felt something crack open in his chest. That was Sarah. "I know," Rachel whispered. "I know it was. I could hear it in her voice, our voice, and I was too much of a coward to tell her who I was." A silence fell between them, heavy with the weight of missed opportunity. Emma finished her bottle and pulled away from Rachel's shoulder, her tiny head lolling back. Rachel rubbed circles on the baby's back until a soft burp emerged from the infant's mouth. "She's going to need to sleep," Rachel said, looking around the room as if a crib might materialize out of nowhere. "There's a dresser drawer," Marcus said. "I can clear it out, put some blankets in it. That's what people do, right?" "That works," Rachel said. She didn't sound entirely confident, but then again, neither did Marcus. He helped her prepare the makeshift bed, pulling out the drawer and lining it with clean sheets and a soft towel. Emma, already fed and content, drifted off almost immediately once Rachel laid her down. The baby looked impossibly small in the drawer, her face smooth and peaceful in sleep, one tiny fist curled against her mouth. Marcus and Rachel stood in the doorway, watching the infant sleep. It was an oddly intimate moment, the kind of thing parents probably shared every night. Marcus felt a pang of grief so sharp it nearly doubled him over. This was what he should have been doing with Sarah. This was the life they were supposed to have. "Thank you," Rachel said softly, "for not turning us away." Marcus didn't trust himself to respond. Instead, he moved to close the door, leaving it open just a crack so the light from the hallway would spill through. "I need to ask you something," Rachel said before he could leave. "What? Did you love her?" Rachel's question hung in the air between them, simple but loaded with complexity. "Sarah, I mean. Did you really love her?" Marcus thought about Sarah on their wedding day, how she'd cried while walking down the aisle, how she'd held his hand so tightly during the vows that her nails left marks on his palm. He thought about all the Tuesday nights they'd spent on the porch watching the stars, all the inside jokes that no one else would ever understand, all the ways she'd loved him, even as the cancer ate her alive from the inside. "Yes," he said, "I loved her." Rachel nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she'd been wondering. I wish I could have known her. So do I, Marcus said, and he meant it in a way that went beyond the obvious. If Rachel had known Sarah earlier, maybe she wouldn't be standing in his hallway, lost and alone, and looking at him with Sarah's eyes. "Good night, Marcus," Rachel said. "Good night," he replied. He went downstairs and stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring at nothing. Outside, the wind moved through the fields, rustling the grass in waves. Somewhere in the house, a pipe creaked. The old Victorian ticked and settled around him, and Marcus realized that for the first time in 3 months, the house didn't feel completely empty. It felt dangerous. Because his promise to Sarah, the promise he'd made in that hospital room with her hand growing cold in his, suddenly felt a lot more fragile than it had an hour ago. Not because of attraction. He didn't feel attracted to Rachel, but because the promise had been about Sarah, about honoring her memory and her wishes. And now Sarah's memory had walked through his front door, wearing a borrowed shirt and carrying an infant with her eyes. Everything had changed, and Marcus had no idea how to navigate what came next. He climbed the stairs slowly, moving past the guest room where Rachel and Emma slept, and entered his bedroom. Sarah's side of the bed was exactly as he'd left it months ago. He hadn't washed the sheets. He couldn't bring himself to do it. Sometimes, on the worst nights, he'd lie on her side just to be close to the ghost of her presence. Tonight, he lay on his side of the bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house, the creaking of the floorboards in the guest room as Rachel moved around, the soft murmur of her voice as she probably checked on Emma, the settling sighs of a house that had been too quiet for too long. And in the darkness, Marcus heard Sarah's voice again, the words from the hospital. "Promise me, Marcus, promise me you won't try to replace me." He'd kept that promise. He hadn't looked at another woman, hadn't gone on dates or tried to move on or done anything that could be construed as moving forward. But keeping the promise had also meant standing still, which was just another way of dying. Now, with Rachel and Emma in the house, Marcus wasn't sure if keeping the promise meant anything anymore. Because the universe had thrown him a curveball that Sarah never could have anticipated, and the rulebook she'd made him memorize didn't have instructions for this. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, knowing it would be impossible. In the guest room, Rachel held Emma close, listening to the sound of Marcus's footsteps above her. She'd lied to him about some things. Not about being Sarah's twin that was real, but about other details. Things she wasn't quite ready to share. Things that would make this already complicated situation even more impossible. She kissed the top of Emma's head and whispered a prayer to a God she wasn't sure was listening. "Just let us stay," she whispered. "Just a little longer. Just until I figure out what to do." Morning came grey and cold. Marcus woke to the sound of a baby crying, not the soft whimper he'd heard occasionally through the night, but a full, committed wail that suggested Emma had decided sleep was overrated and other people should suffer for her decision. He lay in bed for a moment, debating whether to help or pretend he was still asleep. Then he heard Rachel's voice, low and soothing, followed by the sound of cabinet doors opening and closing. She was handling it. Of course she was. He was just a stranger in the next room who'd made a poor decision last night out of grief and loneliness. By the time Marcus showered and made his way downstairs, the smell of coffee filled the kitchen. Rachel was sitting at the table with a bottle propped against Emma's chin while she scrolled through her phone, her face illuminated by the screen. She looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that came from a single restless night, amplified by weeks of prior sleeplessness. "Morning," Marcus said, reaching for a mug. Rachel startled, nearly dropping her phone. "Oh God, you scared me." She set the phone down and watched as Marcus poured coffee from the pot Rachel had made. "I hope you don't mind. I found everything I needed." "It's fine," Marcus said. He meant it. There was something almost normal about the domestic scene, a woman in his kitchen, a baby being fed, the routine of morning rituals resuming. Sarah used to wake early and have coffee ready by the time he came downstairs. He'd forgotten how much he missed that small kindness. Emma was up 3 times, Rachel said, shifting the bottle to check if the baby had finished eating. I think she might be hitting a growth spurt. She fed like she was trying to make up for all the meals she's missed since birth. Rachel adjusted Emma's position slightly. I'm sorry if she woke you. She didn't, Marcus lied. He had been awake, listening to the rhythm of the house, adapting to new inhabitants. Listening to Rachel singing a lullaby in a voice that sounded so much like Sarah's it made his throat tight. Listening to the life he'd thought was over, suddenly showing signs of continuation. I was thinking, Rachel said carefully, that I should probably look for work. I can't just stay here indefinitely. It's not fair to you. Marcus poured milk into his coffee, the white swirling through the dark liquid. What kind of work? Marketing, primarily. I worked in digital marketing for about 8 years before everything fell apart. Rachel paused, watching Emma drink. But honestly, my resume has a 9-month gap, and I'd have to explain why. Most employers aren't exactly sympathetic to unmarried mothers with minimal childcare options. There's the library in Millbrook, Marcus said, surprising himself. Sarah worked there. I could probably talk to the director. They're always looking for people. Rachel looked up at him, her expression shifting into something cautious. You'd do that? Why not? Because you don't know me, Rachel said quietly. Because I showed up on your doorstep yesterday with a baby and a story. Because statistically speaking, I could be a scam artist, a con woman, or just someone deeply unhinged. Marcus met her eyes, Sarah's eyes, and felt the contradiction wash over him again. This was not his wife, but this was also somehow part of his wife. Part of the genetic code that had created Sarah, reincarnated in a different life, a different trajectory. Am I what? Unhinged? A scam artist? Or untrustworthy? Rachel looked away. No, she said, but something in her voice suggested the answer was more complicated than a single syllable could convey. But I haven't been completely honest with you either. Marcus set down his coffee mug slowly. About what? About why I'm really here, Rachel said. She carefully pulled the bottle away from Emma's mouth and began rubbing the baby's back in gentle circles. Yes, I found out about Sarah. Yes, I wanted to meet her and never got the chance. That's all true, but there's more to it than that. I'm listening, Marcus said, though something in his stomach had begun to tighten. Rachel took a breath, gathering courage. My ex-boyfriend Derek, the father. He found out I'd left Denver. He's been calling, texting, threatening, not physically threatening, she clarified quickly, seeing Marcus's expression shift. But threatening to take Emma. He's claiming he has parental rights, that I can't take his daughter across state lines without permission. He's been very clear that if I don't come back and basically give him partial custody while I figure out my life, he's going to pursue legal action. Can he do that? Marcus asked. Legally? Maybe. He's listed as the father on the birth certificate, but practically he has no money for lawyers. He works construction, lives paycheck to paycheck, and has never expressed interest in Emma until I left. He's angry because his control is gone, but that anger is dangerous. It makes him unpredictable. Marcus absorbed this information, turning it over in his mind like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. Why didn't you just tell me this yesterday? Because I barely know you, Rachel said. Because I was desperate and cold, and I just needed somewhere safe to sleep. Because if I'd told you everything, you might have been even more inclined to throw us out. She paused, adjusting Emma on her hip. And because I wasn't entirely sure Derek would actually find me. I thought maybe if I stayed quiet, if I disappeared long enough, he'd give up and move on to the next woman who would tolerate his nonsense. But he found you? He called this morning, Rachel said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, showing Marcus the screen. 17 missed calls from a contact labeled, Derek, do not answer. 5 voicemails, countless text messages in all caps, using language that would have made a sailor blush. He called information, asked about ranches in Millbrook, Nebraska. Apparently, the woman at the diner who told me where to find you also mentioned it to someone at the gas station, and the story got around. Small towns talk. Jesus, Marcus breathed. I know, Rachel said. I know. It's a lot. I know I should have told you immediately, but I was scared, and I was tired, and Emma was sick from traveling, and I needed one night of not feeling like I was running. Marcus walked to the window that overlooked the front drive. From this vantage point, he could see down to the gate. The road beyond was empty, but it wouldn't always be. Derek would come. That much was certain, and when he did, Marcus would have to decide whether this woman, this stranger who looked like his dead wife and had somehow invaded his carefully controlled grief, was worth the complications that would follow. How long have you been looking for work? Marcus asked, still facing the window. What? Rachel sounded confused by the change in subject. Yesterday when you arrived. Had you already been looking or was stopping at my door a Hail Mary? A little of both, Rachel admitted. I checked job postings online at the motel. There wasn't much in Millbrook specifically, but I thought if I stayed put for a few days, figured out how to present myself despite the gap, I could maybe find something online that allowed remote work. The library opens at 10, Marcus said, turning back to face her. I'm going to drive to Millbrook after I feed the horses. I'll talk to Margaret, the director. Her daughter was in my high school class. She owes me a favor. Marcus, you need a job, he continued as if she hadn't spoken. You need money and independence and a way out if staying here becomes untenable. I'm not offering this because I've suddenly become a saint. I'm offering it because if Derek shows up here, things will be easier if you have options. Rachel set Emma down in the carrier that sat on the kitchen counter, securing the straps carefully. When she looked back at Marcus, her eyes were wet. You didn't have to do that. No, Marcus agreed. But I'm doing it anyway. He left before Rachel could respond, before he could overthink what he was doing or why. The barn welcomed him with its familiar sounds and smells, hay and horse, and the particular mustiness of old wood. He moved through the morning routine with autopilot efficiency, feeding the horses, mucking stalls, checking the fence line for breaks. His horse, a temperamental quarter horse named Diesel, nuzzled Marcus's shoulder while he worked. The animal had always sensed Marcus's mood, reacting to his internal weather with an empathy that Marcus had never been able to find in humans. Sarah had loved Diesel, would ride him out to the far pasture and spend hours alone with her thoughts. Marcus hadn't ridden in 3 months. The saddle still hung in the tack room, probably gathering dust. By the time he finished with the morning chores, the sun was attempting to break through the clouds. Marcus showered in the barn's small bathroom, changed into cleaner clothes, and made his way back to the house. Rachel was in the living room, bouncing Emma gently while humming the same lullaby Marcus had heard her sing in the night. She stopped when she heard him enter, but didn't move away from the window where she'd been standing. Thank you, Rachel said quietly, for believing me, for helping. I haven't done anything yet, Marcus replied. Yes, you have, Rachel said. She turned to face him fully, Emma propped on her hip. You believed a story that sounds completely insane. You opened your house to strangers. You're willing to help me find work and build some kind of life. That's everything right now. Marcus felt something shift inside him, a tectonic plate of his carefully constructed grief moving just slightly out of alignment. This was dangerous territory. This was exactly the kind of emotional entanglement that could lead to complications, to broken promises, to choices he'd swear he'd never make. But looking at Rachel, looking at the way she held Emma, the exhaustion etched into the lines around her eyes, the desperate hope flickering in her expression, Marcus realized that sometimes keeping a promise meant breaking it. Sometimes surviving meant letting go of the rules you'd made in a hospital room with a dying woman's hand growing cold in yours. Get Emma ready, he said. We'll drive into town together. Margaret's more likely to take a chance on you if she meets you in person." Rachel's face broke into a smile that was so genuinely grateful it nearly undid him. And for just a moment, Marcus let himself imagine what it might feel like to have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, to have someone who depended on him for more than just keeping the ranch running, to have a life that extended beyond his own grief and isolation. It was a dangerous thought, a forbidden thought, given the promise he'd made. But as Marcus grabbed his keys and headed for the door, he wasn't thinking about Sarah anymore. He was thinking about the present, about the fragile human being in his guest room who'd been abandoned by everyone else. He was thinking about what it meant to be the kind of man who would turn away someone in need, and he was fairly certain Sarah wouldn't have wanted him to be that man, no matter what she'd asked him to promise. The drive into Millbrook took 20 minutes. Rachel sat in the passenger seat of Marcus's truck, Emma secured in a car seat that Marcus had borrowed from a neighbor, no questions asked, which Marcus appreciated. Rachel stared out the window at the landscape rolling past, her fingers drumming an anxious rhythm against her thigh. "You're going to be fine," Marcus said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. "You don't know that," Rachel replied. "You don't know what Margaret's going to think when you walk in with a woman who looks like Sarah and a baby." "Margaret's professional," Marcus said. "She hired Sarah back when there were probably people who objected to that too." Rachel turned to look at him. "Why would people object to Sarah working at the library?" Marcus kept his eyes on the road. "Because she was from money. Her family owned real estate across 3 states. Some people in town thought she was slumming it, playing at being a working person before she inevitably went back to her trust fund." "Was she?" "No," Marcus said simply. "Sarah loved that job. She loved helping people find the stories they needed. She used to say that libraries were the last, truly democratic institutions left. Didn't matter if you had money or not. Everyone got equal access to everything." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "I would have liked her," she said finally. "You would have," Marcus agreed, and there was a strange comfort in that acknowledgement. In the parallel universe where things had been different, where Rachel had found Sarah before the cancer, maybe they would have become close. Maybe Sarah would have helped Rachel navigate becoming a mother. Maybe a lot of things would have been different. Millbrook appeared on the horizon like it always did, a cluster of brick buildings arranged in a grid pattern around a central square. Population 3,847, according to the sign at the town limits. The library was a Carnegie building from 1912, all stone and arched windows, looking slightly out of place among the more modern commercial structures that had grown up around it. Marcus pulled into a parking space and turned off the engine. Rachel was staring at the building with an expression of pure apprehension. "Come on," Marcus said. "Let's get this over with." They made their way inside, Marcus carrying the baby while Rachel carried the diaper bag. The library smelled like books and old carpet and the particular mustiness of a building that had been around for over a century. Margaret was at the circulation desk, checking in returns with the focused intensity of someone who took their job very seriously. She looked up as they approached, and Marcus saw the moment her brain processed what she was seeing. Her expression shifted from professional neutrality to something more complicated, surprise, mixed with something else. Recognition, maybe. Or confusion. "Marcus Webb," Margaret said, standing up. She was in her mid-40s, with greying hair pulled back in a neat bun and reading glasses on a lanyard around her neck. "I haven't seen you since Sarah's funeral." "I know," Marcus said. "I've been busy." Margaret's eyes moved from Marcus to Rachel, and Marcus saw the exact moment she noticed the resemblance. Her eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "And who is this?" "This is Rachel Hartwell," Marcus said. "She's looking for work, and I thought of you. She has experience in digital marketing and administration, and she's a quick learner." Margaret stepped around the desk, extending her hand to Rachel. "Margaret Chen. I was Sarah's supervisor for 3 years. You must be," she paused, searching for the words. "Forgive me if I'm being forward, But are you related to Sarah? Her sister, Rachel said, shaking Margaret's hand. Twin sister. I know it's a shock. I'm still getting used to the reactions. If Margaret was surprised by this revelation, she recovered quickly. Well, that explains the resemblance. Please come to my office. We can talk more privately. She glanced at Marcus. You staying? If that's all right, Marcus said. Margaret led them through the library to a small office tucked behind the children's section. Through the windows, Marcus could see the reading nook where Sarah used to sit during her lunch breaks, always with a stack of new releases she was cataloguing. He felt a familiar ache in his chest, though it was duller now than it had been a few months ago. Time was doing its work, numbing the sharp edges of grief into something more manageable. So, Margaret said, settling into her chair and gesturing for Rachel and Marcus to sit. Tell me about yourself, Rachel. Rachel launched into a practiced explanation of her experience: 8 years in digital marketing, portfolio management, social media strategy, content creation. Margaret listened intently, occasionally jotting notes. Emma, tired from the car ride, had fallen asleep against Marcus's shoulder, her tiny hand curled against his neck. The gap in your employment, Margaret said eventually. What prompted the move to Nebraska? Rachel glanced at Marcus, as if asking permission. He gave a subtle nod. I was pregnant, Rachel said. The situation was complicated. I came to Nebraska to figure things out, and I discovered that I had family here. Sarah, I wanted to know her, but I arrived too late. Margaret's expression softened. I'm sorry. Sarah was a remarkable person. She was actually planning to propose some new initiatives to the library board: digital literacy programs, community outreach to underserved populations. She was passionate about expanding our reach beyond traditional library services. She always was a visionary, Marcus heard himself say. She was, Margaret agreed. She turned back to Rachel. Have you worked in library services before, or would this be a transition? Transition, Rachel admitted. But I'm good with people, and I'm a fast learner, and honestly, I need the work. Margaret studied Rachel for a long moment, and Marcus held his breath. This was the moment where judgment would happen. This was where small-town prejudices and assumptions might override any legitimate qualifications Rachel had. I have a part-time position opening up, Margaret said finally. 20 hours a week, to start. It's not much, but it includes benefits and flexible scheduling for childcare situations. You'd handle digital content creation, social media, and some administrative tasks. It's not the kind of work you were doing in Denver, but it would give you a foundation here. I'll take it, Rachel said immediately. I haven't mentioned the salary yet, Margaret said with a small smile. I don't care, Rachel replied. I need work, and you're offering it. That's all that matters right now. Margaret looked at Marcus, something questioning in her gaze. This is quite the coincidence, isn't it? Sarah's long-lost twin sister showing up at your ranch. It is, Marcus acknowledged. Sarah would have found it interesting, Margaret said. She always said life was more improbable than any fiction anyone could write. She believed in fate, in the idea that people came into your life when you needed them most. Margaret paused, her expression becoming more guarded. I should probably tell you that people are going to talk. A single man with a young widower reputation, a mysterious woman who bears an uncanny resemblance to his dead wife, and a baby. It's going to fuel speculation. Let them speculate, Marcus said, but he felt Rachel tense beside him. I'm not trying to be unkind, Margaret said quickly, but I've worked in Millbrook long enough to know how these things go. People will have theories. Some of them won't be charitable. I'm getting used to that, Rachel said quietly. Margaret sighed. Well, you can start Monday if you'd like. 7 a.m. I'll have the office set up for you. And Rachel? Margaret waited for Rachel to meet her eyes. For what it's worth, I think Sarah would have wanted her sister to have a chance. I think she'd want you here. On the drive back to the ranch, Rachel was quiet, staring out the window at the passing landscape. Emma slept in her car seat, one of those deep infant sleeps where the child seemed to have abandoned consciousness entirely. "You handled that well," Marcus said. "Did I?" Rachel asked. "Or did I just perform desperation convincingly? Does it matter?" "Yes," Rachel said, "because I don't want to be a charity case. I don't want people to hire me because they feel sorry for me or because they have some romantic notion about me being Sarah's sister. I want to be hired because I'm qualified." "You are qualified," Marcus pointed out. "Margaret hired you because you can do the job, not because she felt sorry for you. The fact that you're Sarah's sister just made her more willing to take a chance on you." "That's still charity," Rachel said stubbornly. "Just a different kind." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He was thinking about what Margaret had said about people talking, about the speculation and the gossip that would inevitably follow. He knew how small towns worked. By tomorrow, everyone in Millbrook would know that Marcus Webb had a woman living at his ranch, and they would have drawn their own conclusions about what that meant. Some would probably think he was betraying Sarah's memory. Others might assume something scandalous was happening. Still, others would simply view it as confirmation that Marcus was unstable, that grief had finally broken something fundamental in him. "The things Margaret said," Rachel began, then stopped. "About people talking, about your reputation. Are you worried about that?" "I'm worried about what it means for you," Rachel said. "I don't want my presence to damage your standing in this community. You've been kind to us, but you don't owe me this. You don't owe me your social capital or your reputation or whatever it is you're risking by letting me stay." Marcus pulled the truck onto a back road that cut through some of his property. This was the way he used to drive with Sarah, before the illness took her ability to travel. They'd park at the overlook and watch the sunset paint the sky in shades of purple and gold. He pulled to the side of the road and turned off the engine. "You want to know something?" Marcus said. "When Sarah was sick, the town brought casseroles. They brought flowers and prayers and all the things good Christian people bring when someone is dying. But they didn't actually help. They showed up for an hour, said the right things, and then went home to their normal lives." "That's not fair," Rachel said. "People tried." "They did," Marcus interrupted. "But you know who actually helped? Margaret. She brought meals that could be frozen. She drove Sarah to appointments so I could work. She called to check in, not to hear updates, but to actually talk to Sarah about things other than her illness. She treated Sarah like a person instead of a tragedy." Marcus turned in his seat to face Rachel directly. "I'm not helping you because I feel obligated. I'm helping you because it's the right thing to do, and because you remind me that the world is bigger and more complicated than my own grief. So stop apologizing for existing." Rachel's eyes were wet when she looked at him. "No one's ever—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "No one's ever stood up for me like that." "Then that's a problem that needed fixing," Marcus said simply. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind move through the grass and the soft sounds of Emma sleeping in the back seat. Marcus could see the ranch in the distance, his house, his barn, his fields stretching out like a kingdom of isolation. With Rachel and Emma here, the place felt different. It felt inhabited, not just occupied. He knew what came next. Derek would come looking for Rachel. The town would continue to gossip, and at some point, Marcus would have to confront the reality of his promise to Sarah and what it actually meant in the context of a life that kept insisting on moving forward despite his efforts to keep it frozen. But for now, in this moment, with Rachel beside him and Emma sleeping safely in the back seat, Marcus allowed himself to imagine a different future. Not a replacement for Sarah, never that, but a continuation. A life that honored the past, while acknowledging that the present demanded its own kind of courage. "We should head back," Rachel said eventually. "Emma's going to wake up hungry." "Yeah," Marcus agreed. He started the truck, and they began the drive back toward the ranch. Behind them, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. It was beautiful in a way that made Marcus's chest ache, not with grief this time, but with something more complicated, something that felt dangerously close to hope. 2 weeks passed. Rachel settled into a rhythm at the library that felt almost natural, cataloguing new acquisitions, designing social media posts, helping patrons navigate the digital catalogue system. Margaret had been right about the work being different from her marketing days, but Rachel found something meditative in it. The library was quiet in a way that Denver never was, quiet in a way that allowed her to think without the constant pressure of performance. Emma was growing, her tiny features becoming more defined, her cries taking on distinct meanings that Rachel was learning to interpret. Hungry looked different from tired, which looked different from uncomfortable. It was a language Rachel was beginning to fluently speak. But underneath the surface of this fragile peace, storm clouds were gathering. The first sign came on a Tuesday morning when Rachel arrived at the library to find Margaret waiting by her desk with an expression that could only be described as concerned. "We need to talk," Margaret said quietly. They moved to the break room, which was mercifully empty at 7:30 in the morning. Rachel's stomach did a slow flip. In her experience, sentences that started with "we need to talk" rarely ended well. "Have I done something wrong?" Rachel asked. "No," Margaret said quickly. "You've been excellent at your job." "That's actually the problem." Rachel stared at her. "I don't understand." Margaret sighed and sat down at the small table, gesturing for Rachel to do the same. "Bill Henderson came by the library yesterday. He's the town council president, also owns the feed supply store. He made some comments about me hiring you without doing proper vetting. He suggested that perhaps I was being influenced by my connection to Marcus and my memories of Sarah. He implied that hiring you was questionable judgment. Because I'm unqualified? Because you're unmarried, have a baby, and are living with a widower," Margaret said flatly. "Because the town has decided that you and Marcus are probably having an affair. Because there's a narrative circulating that you seduced a grieving man, and that I'm enabling some sort of scandal." Rachel felt her face flush hot with anger and shame, though she wasn't sure which one was winning. We're not. "I know," Margaret interrupted. "I know it's not true, but perception matters in places like Millbrook. And right now, the perception is that this is a scandal." "Should I resign?" Rachel asked, her voice small. "No," Margaret said, firmly. "You should do your job, and you should let people make their own conclusions. But I wanted to warn you that things might get harder. People might be less friendly. You might encounter some coldness." Rachel had experienced coldness before from Derek's family, from her own parents, from employers who saw her as a liability rather than an asset. But it was a different kind of cold when it came from a place that had, for 2 weeks, felt like it might become home. That afternoon, when Rachel went to pick up formula at the grocery store, the checkout clerk rang up her items without making eye contact. The elderly woman behind her in line made a point of stepping away, creating a visible distance. In the pharmacy section, a group of women stopped talking when Rachel approached to get diapers. The silence that followed her through the store was suffocating. She called Marcus from her car in the parking lot, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. "I'm picking you up," Marcus said without preamble. "Don't go back to the ranch. Wait there." 20 minutes later, Marcus pulled into the parking lot. Rachel climbed into the truck with Emma in her car seat, and Marcus didn't ask questions. He just drove, heading out of town toward the Overlook, where they'd talked 2 weeks earlier. "Margaret told you," Rachel said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Marcus said. "But the diner waitress told me about a conversation she overheard, and the gas station attendant made some pointed comments about my living arrangements. And when I went to get feed this morning, Bill Henderson himself mentioned that people were concerned about my reputation." "I'm so sorry," Rachel whispered. "I never wanted to drag you into this." "You didn't," Marcus said. He pulled into the Overlook and turned off the engine. Small-town gossip would exist with or without you. This is just what happens when people have too much time and not enough information. They fill in the gaps with speculation. "But it's not fair to you," Rachel said. "You've been nothing but kind, and now people think you're that we're." She couldn't finish the sentence. "A man and a woman living together must obviously be romantic," Marcus said with a bitter laugh. "Never mind that you're grieving and I'm a widower. Never mind that you're working and trying to build a life for your daughter. Never mind that I promised my wife I wouldn't marry again, and I haven't married you. The narrative is too juicy for the truth to matter." Rachel stared out at the landscape stretching before them. It was beautiful, endless fields of golden grass, mountains in the distance, sky that went on forever. But it also felt claustrophobic, like a trap disguised as freedom. "I should leave," Rachel said quietly. "I should take Emma and go somewhere else. Somewhere where my presence doesn't make things harder for you." Marcus turned to look at her. "No. Marcus, no," he repeated more firmly. "You're not running. Not because of rumors. Not because people are small-minded and cruel. You're staying because you have a job and an apartment situation and a life that's starting to build. And I'm not letting you abandon that, because the town gossip mill can't handle the fact that a man and a woman can live in the same space without it being a sexual scandal. But your reputation. My reputation was already damaged the day I married Sarah," Marcus interrupted. "Do you know what people said about her? That she was slumming it with a rancher because it was trendy. That she'd eventually get bored and leave me for someone with more money and social standing. That I'd married above my station and she'd wake up one day and regret it." Rachel had heard some of this from Margaret, but hearing it from Marcus made it more real, more painful. "And you know what I did about it?" Marcus continued. "I loved her anyway. I loved her so much that what other people thought became irrelevant. And I would make the same choice 1,000 times, even knowing how it would end." "This is different," Rachel said. "Is it?" Marcus asked. "Because, from where I'm sitting, you're the sister of the woman I loved. You're someone who's been abandoned by everyone in your life except your daughter. You're someone who deserves a chance to have a stable life, and I'm in a position to help provide that. The fact that people want to make it into something sordid says more about them than it does about us." Rachel felt tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "I don't know how to stay when everything inside me is telling me to run." "Yes, you do," Marcus said. He reached over and took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "You've been running your whole life. You ran from Denver when Derek became abusive. You ran from your family when they rejected you. You ran from one cheap motel to another, trying to find a safe place to land. Running is what you know, but staying is what you need to learn." "What if Derek comes?" Rachel asked. "What if he shows up and makes everything worse?" "Then we'll deal with it," Marcus said. "Together." Rachel looked down at their intertwined hands. She thought about all the places she'd been in the past year, crowded shelters, questionable motels, her car on the side of highways, running from a man who'd made it clear that Emma was a possession rather than a person. She thought about the library job that Margaret had given her despite the gossip, the kind of work that made her feel like she was building something meaningful. She thought about Eli's porch, where Emma slept peacefully every night in a drawer lined with clean sheets. She thought about Marcus standing in his kitchen in the morning with coffee in hand, asking how she'd slept, if she needed anything. She thought about what it meant to stop running. "Okay," Rachel said. "I'll stay." That evening, Marcus made a decision of his own. He drove into Millbrook while Rachel watched. Emma. And he went straight to the diner where the waitress worked. He sat at the counter and ordered coffee, and when she brought it, he met her eyes directly. "Whatever you heard about Rachel living at my ranch, spread the word that I'm helping someone who needed help," Marcus said. "She's Sarah's sister. She showed up with nothing, and I offered her a place to stay and a job opportunity through Margaret. If anyone has a problem with that, They can come talk to me directly. The waitress's face flushed. I didn't mean to cause trouble. Then stop spreading rumors, Marcus said simply. He left money on the counter and drove to the feed store, where he found Bill Henderson stocking supplies. Bill, Marcus said, I hear you've got concerns about my living situation. Bill looked up, his expression immediately defensive. Just community matters, Marcus. Nothing personal. It is personal, Marcus said. You're questioning my character based on gossip. And more importantly, you're questioning the character of a woman you don't know, who's just trying to build a life for her daughter. That's not community concern. That's judgment without facts. People are talking, Bill said uncomfortably. People are always talking, Marcus replied. That doesn't make what they're saying true. Rachel is staying at my ranch because she needed help, and I was in a position to give it. That's all. Nothing more, nothing less. And I'd appreciate it if you'd remember that before you question someone's virtue. Marcus left the store without waiting for a response. It probably wouldn't change people's minds. Gossip had a momentum all its own, and once it started, it was almost impossible to stop. But sometimes you had to push back against the narrative anyway. Sometimes you had to stand up for what was right, even if it was unpopular. When he got home, Rachel was on the porch with Emma, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. She turned when she heard his truck pull up the drive. "Where did you go?" she asked. "Around," Marcus said. He joined her on the porch, sitting in one of the rocking chairs beside hers. "Just reminding some people that rumors aren't facts." "Marcus, don't thank me," he said. "This isn't about me. It's about the principle that people deserve to be judged on their actions, not on speculation and gossip." They sat in silence as the sun dipped below the horizon. Emma made small cooing sounds, her tiny fingers wrapped around Rachel's thumb. The wind moved through the fields, carrying the smell of hay and dry grass and the particular silence of rural Nebraska. "I've been thinking," Rachel said after a while, "about what comes next. Not running away, I'm staying, but I've been thinking about what it looks like to actually build a life here, to not be temporary." "What does it look like?" Marcus asked. "I don't know yet," Rachel admitted, "but I think I want to find out." Marcus nodded. He understood what she meant, the shift from survival mode to actually living, from simply getting through each day to imagining a future that extended beyond the next crisis. It was a small shift, but it was a beginning. The call came on a Friday morning while Rachel was at the library. Margaret found her in the back office, organizing digital files, and handed her the phone with a grave expression. "It's someone asking for you," Margaret said. "Wouldn't give his name." Rachel's stomach tightened. She took the phone, pressing it to her ear. "Hello, so you're in Nebraska." The voice on the other end was unmistakably Derek's, rough, aggressive, laced with the particular menace of a man who felt wronged. "Took me long enough to find you. Thought you were being smart, but you're just being stupid. Derek, I told you we're done." "You don't get to tell me anything," Derek interrupted. "You took my daughter across state lines without permission. That's kidnapping, Rachel. That's a federal crime. And I've already talked to a lawyer about pressing charges." Rachel's hand was shaking. Through the window of the office, she could see Margaret pretending not to listen, but clearly listening with the intensity of someone whose protective instincts had been activated. "I have her name on the birth certificate," Rachel said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm her mother. I have custody. For now," Derek said with a laugh that made her skin crawl, "but I can change that. I have documentation of your living situation, shacking up with some old rancher, probably screwing him for shelter. What kind of mother does that make you? What kind of life are you providing for Emma?" "I'm hanging up," Rachel said. "Fine," Derek replied, "but I'm coming to get my daughter. I'm driving to Nebraska right now, should be there by tomorrow morning. And when I get there, we're going to settle this the right way. Either you come back to Denver with me, and we figure this out, or I take this to court, and I make sure you never see Emma again. Your choice." The line went dead. Rachel stood in the middle of Margaret's office, phone still pressed to her ear, unable to move. Margaret immediately came around the desk and took the phone from her hand, guiding her to a chair. "Sit," Margaret commanded. "Take deep breaths. Tell me what happened." Rachel recounted the conversation in a voice that didn't quite sound like her own. By the time she finished, Margaret's face had gone pale with anger. "That's a threat," Margaret said flatly. "That's coercion and threat. We need to call the police." "And tell them what?" Rachel asked. "That my daughter's father is angry? That he's coming to town? There's nothing illegal about that. He has parental rights. In his mind, he's coming to retrieve his daughter. He also threatened custody and made it contingent on you returning to Denver with him," Margaret pointed out. "That's coercion." But Rachel was already thinking ahead, already running through scenarios and worst-case situations. Derek was a construction worker with a mean streak and an ego that couldn't handle being left. He would come to town, he would make a scene, and he would try to take Emma. Marcus's reputation would take another hit. The town would have real ammunition for their gossip. And if Derek actually followed through on his threat about lawyers and custody battles, Rachel wouldn't have the resources to fight him. She had maybe $1,000 saved. Derek, despite his blue-collar job, came from money. His family would fund a custody battle. "I have to tell Marcus," Rachel said, standing up. "He needs to know." "Rachel, wait," Margaret began. But Rachel was already heading for the door. She didn't wait for her shift to end. She simply left, drove the 15 miles to the ranch, and found Marcus mending fence in the far pasture. She had to drive the truck halfway into the field to reach him. Marcus took one look at her face and dropped his tools. "Derek called," Rachel said without preamble. "He's coming tomorrow morning. He wants Emma, and he's threatening custody charges if I don't come back to Denver with him." Marcus was quiet for a moment, his expression shifting into something harder, more focused. "Okay," he said finally, "we'll handle it." "How?" Rachel asked, her voice breaking. "He's right, Marcus. I don't have resources for a custody battle. He has family money. He'll destroy me in court. Then we make sure he doesn't get to court," Marcus said. "What does that mean?" "It means we talk to a lawyer," Marcus said. He started walking toward the truck, and Rachel followed. "There's a guy in town, James Harrison, used to work for the county legal department. He does private work now. We get his advice before Derek shows up." By that afternoon, they were sitting in James Harrison's cramped office above the post office, going over the specifics of Rachel's situation. James was a thin man in his 60s, with sharp eyes that didn't miss anything. "You have legitimate custody as the mother and the custodial parent," James explained. "Your name is on the birth certificate as the sole custodian. The father's rights are limited unless he's been financially supporting the child or actively involved in caregiving, which your account suggests he hasn't been." "But he's threatening to take this to court," Rachel said. "He can threaten," James said. "But filing a custody case is expensive, and from what you're telling me, he doesn't have the resources. More importantly, if he shows up at your residence and attempts to take Emma without legal custody documentation, that could constitute theft of a minor, regardless of his parental claims. He'd be crossing into criminal territory." "So what do I do?" Rachel asked. "You document everything," James said. He pulled out a notepad and started writing. "You get his threat recorded, if possible, a text message confirmation of his intentions to retrieve the child and his threats about custody. You have witnesses to his threatening behavior, and if he shows up at your residence and tries to take Emma, you call the police immediately. Don't argue with him. Don't engage. Just call law enforcement and let them handle it. He might not show up here," Marcus said. "He might try to take her from the library or somewhere public." "Also possible," James acknowledged, "in which case Rachel should probably take some time off work. Stay at home. Keep Emma secured. If he can't find you, he can't take her." And if he does find you and tries something, we have documentation of his threatening behavior, which strengthens your legal position." By the time they left James's office, it was late afternoon. Marcus drove in silence, and Rachel could see the tension in his jaw, the tightness around his eyes. When they got back to the ranch, he made a phone call to a contractor he'd worked with before, asking if the man could come over and install a few security measures. Better locks, motion sensor lights outside, a reinforced lock on the bedroom doors. "Marcus, he's not going to break in," Rachel protested. "Maybe not," Marcus agreed, "but I'm not taking chances with Emma's safety." That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She lay in her room, listening to every sound, the creak of the house settling, the wind moving through the fields, the occasional rustling that might have been wildlife or might have been her paranoia amplified by fear. At 2 in the morning, she got up and checked on Emma, who slept peacefully, unaware that her entire life might be about to change. Marcus was sitting on the porch when Rachel came downstairs, wrapped in a blanket despite the relative warmth of the night. She joined him, settling into the rocking chair beside his. "I'm sorry," Rachel said quietly. "I'm sorry for bringing this into your life. I'm sorry for Derek, for the town, for everything." "Stop apologizing," Marcus said. "None of this is your fault, isn't it?" Rachel asked. "If I hadn't come here, if I'd just stayed in Denver and dealt with Derek like I was supposed to—" "You were running from an abusive man," Marcus interrupted. "You were protecting your daughter. That's not something to apologize for." They sat in silence for a while, watching the fields in the darkness. Rachel could barely see Marcus's face in the starlight, but she could feel the solidity of his presence beside her, the sense that he was steady when everything else was falling apart. "After Sarah died," Marcus said eventually, "I made that promise because I thought it would preserve something. Like if I just didn't move forward, didn't change, didn't allow anyone else into my life, then the life I'd had with Sarah would still exist somewhere. It would be frozen, perfect, unchanged." "But," Rachel prompted. "But life doesn't work that way," Marcus said. "Life keeps moving, whether you move with it or not. And freezing yourself in grief doesn't preserve the good times, it just wastes the time you have left." "Where are you going with this?" Rachel asked. "I'm saying that having you and Emma here has shown me something," Marcus continued. "It's shown me that there's room in my life for other people, for new connections, without betraying what I had with Sarah. I think she'd want that for me. And I think if she could see you and Emma now, she'd want to help protect both of you." Rachel felt tears spilling down her cheeks. She reached over and took Marcus's hand, and they sat like that as the night deepened around them. At 6 in the morning, Rachel heard the sound of an engine on the drive. Her heart rate spiked immediately. She went to the window and saw a truck pulling up a battered Chevy that looked vaguely familiar. Then the door opened, and Derek stepped out. He looked worse than Rachel remembered, thinner, with a rough beard and anger radiating off him like heat from a fire. He was carrying a duffel bag, as if he planned to stay. Marcus was already outside, standing on the porch with his arms crossed, blocking the entrance to the house. "I'm not sure who you are, but you're trespassing on private property," Marcus said calmly. "I suggest you get back in your vehicle and leave." "I'm Derek Caldwell," Derek said, his voice loud and aggressive. "I'm here to collect my daughter. This is between me and Rachel. It doesn't concern you, it concerns me," Marcus said, "because Rachel and Emma are under my protection. If you're here to harass them, you need to leave. Now." Derek's face flushed with anger. He moved toward the porch, and Marcus stepped down to meet him. For a moment, Rachel thought there might be actual violence, but then Derek seemed to calculate the odds and stepped back. "Rachel!" Derek shouted toward the house. "Get Emma and come out here. We're leaving." Rachel remained inside, watching from the window. She didn't respond, didn't acknowledge him. Marcus maintained his position, a barrier between Derek and the house. "You can't keep her from me," Derek continued, his voice becoming almost shrill. "She's my daughter. I have rights." "You have no rights here," Marcus said flatly. "You're on my property, and you're unwelcome." Leave, or I'm calling the sheriff." For a long moment, Derek looked like he might actually charge forward. His fists were clenched, his chest heaving with agitation. But then, as if some internal calculation had completed, his expression shifted. He dropped the duffel bag. "Fine," he said. "Keep her. But when my lawyer sends you the custody paperwork, don't say I didn't warn you." He got back in his truck, tires kicking up gravel as he executed a violent three-point turn and headed back down the drive. Rachel stood frozen at the window, not quite believing what had just happened. Derek had backed down. He'd actually backed down. She ran outside, where Marcus was standing watching the truck disappear down the road. "He's gone," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. "He'll be back," Rachel said, "or his lawyer will send something." "Probably," Marcus agreed. "But not today. Today, you and Emma are safe." Rachel looked at this man, this quiet, steadfast man who'd taken in a stranger and her baby, who'd stood up to her abusive ex-boyfriend, who'd faced down the judgment of his entire town. She looked at his face, weathered by sun and grief, and she made a decision that she'd been avoiding since the day she arrived. "I'm not leaving," Rachel said. "I'm staying. I'm building a life here with Emma. And if you'll have us, if you'll let us stay, I want to." She paused, searching for the right words. "I want to be part of this, part of your life, not as a guest, as something more." Marcus looked at her for a long moment, and in his expression, Rachel saw the exact moment his promise to Sarah shifted from absolute to negotiable. "Okay," Marcus said quietly, "let's figure out what that looks like." 3 days passed in an uneasy calm. Derek didn't return to the ranch, but his presence hung over everything like a storm that hadn't quite broken. Rachel checked her phone obsessively, waiting for legal paperwork that hadn't yet arrived. James Harrison had assured her that Derek was bluffing, that custody cases took time and money, but the waiting was its own kind of torture. Marcus seemed to have slipped into a different mode, hyper-vigilant, protective, constantly checking the property for any sign of intrusion. He'd installed additional locks on the barn, reinforced the gate, kept his shotgun cleaned and loaded by the bedroom door. Rachel understood he was trying to protect them, but his intensity was beginning to feel suffocating. On the 4th night, the fire started. Rachel woke to the smell of smoke, not the pleasant campfire variety, but something acrid and chemical that made her throat burn immediately. She bolted upright in bed, disoriented, then grabbed Emma from her drawer bed and ran toward the hallway. Marcus was already moving, phone in one hand, flashlight in the other. "The barn," he said tersely. "Get to the truck, take Emma and drive to town. Call 911 on the way." "But," Rachel protested. "Now," Marcus commanded, and Rachel had never heard that tone from him before. It was the voice of a man whose priorities had crystallized into a single point: protecting the child. Rachel grabbed the car seat, Emma screaming from being jolted awake, and ran for Marcus's truck. She fumbled with the keys he'd thrown her, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fit the key into the ignition. Behind her, she could see the glow from the barn growing brighter, flames beginning to lick at the wooden structure. She pulled out onto the road, Emma's screams mixing with the sound of sirens in the distance. Her phone was on the passenger seat, and she called 911 while driving, her voice barely steady enough to explain the situation. "My boyfriend's barn is on fire," she said, then corrected herself. "The ranch at," she gave the address. "There's a man inside. Marcus Webb. He owns the property. I don't know if he got out." The dispatcher assured her that fire trucks were already en route, having received multiple calls from neighbors who'd seen the flames. Rachel drove the 15 miles to Millbrook in what felt like seconds and minutes, simultaneously time becoming meaningless when you were operating on pure adrenaline and terror. The fire station was only 3 blocks from downtown. Rachel pulled up and ran inside, still carrying Emma, who had cried herself into exhausted silence. "My boyfriend," Rachel gasped, to the first firefighter she saw. "Marcus Webb. His barn is on fire. I don't know if he got out." The firefighter's expression immediately shifted. "You need to wait here. Come with me." He led her to a waiting area where other concerned citizens had gathered, people Rachel recognized from the town. Margaret was there, her face pale with shock. Bill Henderson, the feed store owner who'd expressed concerns about Rachel's presence, was pacing anxiously. "They'll get him out," Margaret said immediately, coming to put an arm around Rachel. "Marcus is smart. He'll get out." But Rachel wasn't sure that was true. Marcus had looked at her with an expression of such focused determination when he'd sent her away that she wasn't entirely certain he had any intention of leaving the barn. Horses were expensive. Equipment was irreplaceable. And Marcus had a way of sacrificing for the things he loved. 20 minutes felt like 20 hours. Rachel sat in that waiting area, Emma beginning to fuss for food she didn't have, while firefighters came and went with updates that told her nothing concrete. The barn was fully engulfed. They were working on containing the fire to prevent it from spreading to the house. Structural integrity was compromised. No one mentioned Marcus. It was Bill Henderson, who finally stood up and pulled out his phone. "I'm going to the ranch," he said to no one in particular. "I need to see what's happening out there." Margaret squeezed Rachel's arm. "Come on, let's get Emma some formula from the market next door." They were in the convenience store when Rachel's phone rang. Her heart nearly stopped at the sound. She answered without looking at the caller ID. "Rachel?" It was Marcus's voice, hoarse and strained. "I'm at the county hospital. I got out. I'm okay." Rachel felt her knees weaken. She grabbed onto Margaret's arm for balance. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "Smoke inhalation," Marcus said. "The doctors want to keep me overnight for observation. Some minor burns on my arms, but nothing serious. I'm okay, Rachel. I'm okay." "Why didn't you leave immediately?" Rachel asked, her voice climbing into hysteria. "Why did you wait?" "Because the horses were still in there," Marcus said simply. "I had to get them out." Rachel felt rage and relief and terror all tangling together in her chest. "Don't you ever do that again. Do you understand me? Don't you ever risk your life like that?" "I understand," Marcus said quietly. Margaret drove Rachel and Emma to the hospital. The emergency room was controlled chaos, several firefighters being checked for various injuries, a few ranch hands from neighboring properties who'd come to help, and Marcus sitting in a treatment room, shirtless, while a nurse wrapped gauze around his forearms. Rachel ran to him, Emma still in her arms, and for a moment she couldn't speak. She just stood there, looking at him, at the bandages covering his arms, at the singed hair on his chest, at the exhaustion written across his features. "Hi," Marcus said softly. "I'm okay." "You're an idiot," Rachel said, her voice breaking. "You're a complete idiot." "Probably," Marcus agreed. "But the horses are safe. The equipment is gone. The barn is destroyed. But the animals made it." Rachel set Emma down carefully on the hospital bed and pulled Marcus into a hug, trying to be gentle around his injuries, but unable to hold back the ferocity of her need to confirm he was alive and present and real. "I thought you were dead," she whispered into his shoulder. "I thought I was going to lose you." Marcus's good arm came around her, holding her close. "I'm not going anywhere." The doctor came in, then a woman in her 50s with competent hands and a no-nonsense demeanor. She assured Marcus that his injuries were relatively minor, that the smoke inhalation was the main concern, but his oxygen levels were good. She wanted to keep him overnight for observation, but he'd likely be able to go home in the morning. "The barn is a total loss," the fire chief informed them later, appearing in the hospital room with a clipboard and grim determination. "We're still investigating the cause, but preliminary findings suggest arson. The fire was set deliberately in multiple locations using an accelerant." Rachel felt the words land like physical blows. "Arson? Who would?" She didn't have to finish the question. She and Marcus exchanged looks, and the same name hung unspoken between them: Derek. The sheriff arrived within the hour to take statements. No, Marcus hadn't seen who started the fire. Yes, he'd been approached by Derek Caldwell 3 days earlier. No, they hadn't had any contact since that initial confrontation. But they had legal counsel James Harrison, who was aware of Derek's threats and his patterns of escalation. "We'll bring him in for questioning," the sheriff said. "But we'll need evidence. Eyewitnesses, surveillance footage, something concrete. The burn patterns will probably show where the fire was set," the fire chief offered. "That might give us direction." Over the next 48 hours, investigators combed through the ashes of the barn and found evidence of deliberate fire setting in 4 separate locations, classic arson signature. Derek was brought in for questioning, but had an alibi. He'd been at a bar in Denver when the fire started, surrounded by witnesses. Either he'd hired someone to set the fire, or someone else had done it, but without definitive proof, the authorities couldn't make an arrest. "This is the escalation phase," James Harrison explained to Marcus and Rachel in his office. "Derek's initial intimidation didn't work, confrontation didn't work, so he's moved to property destruction. It's dangerous. It's also a sign that his threats about custody might be more serious than we initially assessed." "What do we do?" Rachel asked. "We document everything," James said. "We file a report with the custody authorities about the threats and the property destruction. We ensure that Derek's aggressive pattern is on record. And we prepare for the possibility that he's going to escalate further." "How much further can he escalate?" Marcus asked, his arm around Rachel's waist protectively. "He could come back," James said quietly. "He could try to actually take Emma. He could escalate to physical violence against either of you. The fact that he destroyed property suggests he's beyond rational thinking at this point. He's in a revenge mindset." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing. Then he looked at Rachel. "We need to get married." Rachel blinked. "What?" "We need to get married," Marcus repeated. "If you're my wife, your custody arrangement with Emma becomes more complicated for Derek. You'd have spousal support, marital assets to draw on for legal fees. It would strengthen your position." "Marcus," Rachel began. "I'm not asking as a romantic gesture," Marcus said quickly. "I know the timing is terrible. I know we're in crisis mode. I know this isn't how either of us probably imagined it would happen. But legally, marriage would protect you. And He paused, his expression shifting into something more vulnerable. "I want to protect you. I want Emma to be legally mine too. I want us to be a family." Rachel looked at this man who'd rescued her from nothing, who'd stood up to her abusive ex-boyfriend, who'd literally run into a burning barn to save horses that weren't even his responsibility. She thought about the promise he'd made to Sarah and how that promise had gradually transformed from a constraint into something else, a weight that had lifted once he realized that honoring Sarah's memory didn't mean sacrificing his own future. "Yes," Rachel said quietly. "Okay, yes." They were married by a justice of the peace 3 days later in a small courthouse ceremony with Margaret and James Harrison as witnesses. Rachel wore a simple white dress she'd found at a discount store. Marcus wore a suit that Margaret had helped him pick out. Emma wore a tiny pink dress that made her look like a miniature doll. It wasn't the wedding either of them might have planned. There were no flowers, no family gathered, no romantic gestures or carefully choreographed moments. There was just the legal documentation of a commitment that had already happened in all the ways that mattered. When the justice of the peace pronounced them married, Marcus kissed Rachel with a gentleness that contradicted the intensity of everything that had led to this moment. And Rachel understood that this kiss was different from any romantic moment in a novel or movie. It was a promise, yes, but not the kind made in hospital rooms to dying women. It was a promise to move forward, to build something new, to let the future reshape them both into people Sarah might not have recognized, but would have understood. That evening, as the sun set over the blackened remains of the barn, Marcus and Rachel sat on the porch with Emma between them in her carrier. The property looked devastated, the barn completely destroyed, the fields still showing scorch marks from the firefighting efforts. "We'll rebuild," Marcus said as if reading Rachel's thoughts. "It'll take time, but we'll rebuild." "The barn?" Rachel asked. "Everything," Marcus said. He reached over and took Rachel's hand. "The barn, the fence, the life we're building, all of it." Rachel squeezed his hand, feeling the faint tremor of pain from his burns, but not pulling away. She thought about the promise Marcus had made to Sarah, and she thought about how sometimes promises made in grief needed to be broken in order to be truly honored. Sarah had wanted Marcus to be happy. Sarah had wanted him to move forward. And in marrying Rachel, in choosing to build a life that included not just the memory of his first wife, but the reality of a present with a second chance at love, Marcus was finally keeping the spirit of that original promise, even if he was breaking its letter. Outside, the wind moved through the charred remains of the barn, carrying the smell of smoke and ash and beginnings. The insurance settlement arrived on a cold morning in November. Marcus held the check in his hand, staring at it like it might vanish if he looked away too long. $347,000, enough to rebuild the barn, enough to upgrade the house, enough to secure the future in ways that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier. He was sitting at the kitchen table when Rachel came down, already dressed for her shift at the library. She'd been promoted to full-time 3 weeks ago after Margaret had publicly praised her work ethic and innovative digital programs. The town's gossip had largely shifted from scandal to grudging respect, especially after the story of the barn fire and arson investigation had become public knowledge. Derek was under investigation for potential conspiracy to commit arson, though the evidence remained circumstantial. The threat, however, had diminished significantly. "Insurance?" Rachel asked, seeing the expression on Marcus's face. Marcus nodded and handed her the check. Rachel's eyes widened as she read the amount. "This is amazing," she said, sitting down beside him. "This means you can rebuild everything." Marcus corrected gently. "We can rebuild everything. This is our property now. Our life." Rachel smiled. That particular smile that had become more frequent over the past month, a smile that came from actually believing she had a future worth planning for. She kissed him lightly on the forehead before heading to the library, and Marcus found himself watching her go, still slightly amazed that she was real, that this was his life now. Emma was 3 months old, and she'd become the unexpected center of gravity around which Marcus's entire existence now rotated. He'd never thought of himself as someone who wanted children. But holding Emma in the early morning hours when she couldn't sleep, or watching her track his movement across a room with her unfocused infant gaze, Marcus understood something he'd never quite grasped before. Becoming a parent was about surrendering to love in a way that made all other loves seem like rehearsals. That afternoon, Marcus met with a contractor named Frank Delgado, who came highly recommended by several neighbors. They walked the property where the barn had stood, surveying the blackened foundation and the scattered remains of what had been a functional structure for over 70 years. "What do you want?" Frank asked, his notebook open, his expression thoughtful. "Better," Marcus said. "Stronger. Something that will last another 70 years. He paused, thinking about Rachel and Emma, about the life they were building. "And bigger. I want room to expand, maybe a stable for more horses, room for a future that's bigger than what I had before." Frank nodded, making notes. "Timeline?" "Spring," Marcus said. "I want it finished by late spring so we can get the animals settled before next winter." Over the next 3 weeks, Frank and his crew began the reconstruction. The foundation was reinforced. New framing was erected using treated timber that would resist rot and weather far better than the original wood. Modern ventilation systems were installed. A hayloft was redesigned for better access and safety. The new barn was taking shape as something better than what had existed before, a structure built not just from necessity, but from intention and care. Rachel watched the reconstruction with the same fascination Marcus had. She'd come out to the property on her days off, carrying Emma in a front carrier, walking the perimeter of the new structure and offering observations that came from a completely different perspective than Marcus's. "What if we put a small office here?" she suggested one afternoon, pointing to a corner of the building. "Somewhere where you could manage the ranch operations in bad weather, and maybe windows on this side so you can see out to the fields." Marcus found himself implementing her suggestions, not because he felt obligated, but because they made sense. The office, she suggested, had perfect sight lines to the access gates. The windows, she recommended, offered practical advantages alongside the simple pleasure of being able to see the landscape while working. 2 months into the reconstruction, Rachel made an announcement that changed everything. "I'm pregnant," she said, holding up a positive pregnancy test like it was the most precious thing she'd ever held. Marcus stared at the test, then at Rachel's face, searching for any sign that she was joking. "What?" "We're having a baby," Rachel said, laughing at his expression. "Our baby. Well, biologically it's just mine, but it's ours," Marcus interrupted. He pulled her close, careful of the still fragile nature of her body after childbirth less than 4 months ago. "It's absolutely ours." The news settled into Marcus's chest like something finally clicking into place. A year ago, he would have said that his life was over. He'd made a promise to a dying woman, and he'd intended to keep that promise by becoming a monument to the past. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. The universe kept insisting that he move forward, that he build something new, that he allow himself to become someone different. He thought about Sarah then, not with the sharp pain that had characterized his grief in the early months, but with a bittersweet tenderness. He thought about how Sarah would have loved Emma, how she would have been excited about the new baby, would have probably insisted on being involved in the nursery design, how she would have looked at Rachel and recognized something familiar, not just in the biological resemblance, but in the particular way Rachel loved, without expecting anything in return. He understood now that the promise Sarah had made him swear had never been about keeping him from happiness. It had been about making sure he didn't marry out of desperation, didn't rush into something that would dishonor what they'd had. And he hadn't. He'd married Rachel because she'd become essential to his life, because Emma had become as much his daughter as if he'd fathered her biologically, because the woman who'd shown up at his door bearing Sarah's face had somehow become the person who made his present worth living. Spring arrived with a suddenness that caught everyone off guard. One day the ground was frozen and grey, the next green shoots were breaking through the soil, and the smell of new growth filled the air. The new barn stood completed, gleaming with fresh wood and new metal, looking simultaneously like a monument to what had been lost and a promise of what could be built. The ranch hands Marcus had hired to help with the reconstruction stood back to admire their work. The barn was bigger than the original, more functional, and built to last. Marcus paid them generously and watched as they left the property with satisfaction in their expressions. Good work, appreciated and compensated fairly. It was a simple formula that somehow often got lost in the complications of human interaction. That evening, Marcus stood alone in the new barn, walking its length, running his hand along the smooth beams, imagining the life that would be lived within these walls. Horses would be born here. Equipment would be maintained. Seasons would pass. Emma and the baby Rachel was carrying, and any children that might follow after would play in this space. They would become familiar with the smell of hay and earth, with the rhythm of ranch work, with the knowledge that comfort and safety required maintenance and care. Margaret came by the ranch the next day with a housewarming gift, a framed photograph of Sarah taken from the library's archives. It was Sarah on her first day of work, standing in front of the stacks with a smile that contained the entire future she'd imagined but never reached. "I thought you should have this," Margaret said, handing the photograph to Rachel. Sarah was so proud of this job. She loved the library, loved the community here, despite the gossip. She would have wanted you to know that. Rachel took the photograph carefully, studying her twin's face with an expression of profound sadness. "I wish I'd known her," Rachel said quietly. "She knew you," Margaret said, which was perhaps not literally true, but it felt true in a way that mattered. She knew that somewhere out there was another version of herself, living a different life. I think if she could have chosen, she would have wanted that version to find her way to happiness. And it seems like you have. After Margaret left, Rachel spent a long time looking at the photograph at the woman who was her mirror and her mystery, who had lived a life Rachel would never know, but whose DNA ran through Rachel's veins, and whose story had shaped the circumstances that led Rachel to her current happiness. "I'm going to tell our children about you," Rachel said to the photograph, speaking to the image of Sarah with the kind of reverence usually reserved for prayer. "I'm going to make sure they know they had an aunt who loved books and believed in community and wanted good things for people, even when the world told her that wanting good things was foolish." Marcus found her, standing there, holding the photograph, and he wrapped his arms around her from behind. They stood like that for a long time, honoring both the woman who had been and the woman who was becoming. Over the next months, the ranch transformed. The new barn was filled with equipment and hay and the promise of animals to come. The house got fresh paint, a soft cream color with dark green shutters that made it look welcoming rather than haunted. The fencing was repaired and upgraded. Gardens were planted, not just the vegetable garden Rachel had been tending, but flower beds around the house that would bloom in waves throughout the growing season. Local contractors who'd come to respect Marcus's work ethic and fair dealing began recommending him to others. A small reputation for quality ranch management began to emerge. Ranchers from neighboring properties would stop by to discuss breeding programs and rotational grazing patterns. Marcus found himself respected in a community that had largely dismissed him as a grief-broken hermit just months earlier. And Rachel was blooming in ways that seemed almost miraculous. She'd transitioned to part-time work at the library to prepare for Emma's arrival, but Margaret had given her the flexibility to maintain her position indefinitely. Her digital programs had become popular with the town's youth, and the library had seen its foot traffic increase by 30% in just 2 quarters. Rachel's name appeared in the local paper as one of the town's emerging leaders. She attended town council meetings. She spoke thoughtfully about community needs. She became, quite unexpectedly, a person of influence in Millbrook. The day Emma turned 6 months old, Marcus and Rachel took her to the overlook where they'd first talked about building a future. The sunset was particularly spectacular that evening, the sky painted in shades of amber and rose and violet, like someone had dropped watercolors into the atmosphere and let them blend. "I need to tell you something," Rachel said, sitting on the blanket they'd spread across the grass. Emma was nestled in her lap, her tiny hands grasping at the fabric of Rachel's dress. "What?" Marcus asked, though he could see it in her face, the suppressed excitement, the barely contained joy. "I found out about Derek," Rachel said. "His lawyer finally sent formal custody documentation, but instead of pursuing shared custody, he's actually relinquished all parental rights." Marcus blinked. "What? Why would he do that?" "He's engaged," Rachel said, "to someone else. And apparently she's very clear about the fact that she doesn't want to raise another man's child. He's choosing her over Emma. He's choosing to pretend Emma doesn't exist in order to have a fresh start with this new woman." Marcus felt a complex mixture of emotions: anger at Derek for abandoning Emma, relief that the legal threat had been neutralized, and something that approached pity for a man who would give up his own daughter rather than accept responsibility for his past. "So Emma is legally yours," Rachel continued. "When our baby is born, they'll both have your last name. They'll both be full siblings. You'll be their legal father." Marcus looked at Emma, this tiny human who'd arrived at his doorstep half a year ago in the arms of a desperate woman, and who'd somehow become the center of his entire world. He thought about how the universe had taken his broken pieces and reassembled them into something stronger, something that could hold more love than he'd known was possible. "She's already my daughter," Marcus said. "The paperwork just makes it official." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Rachel leaned against Marcus, and they sat together watching the sky transform from day into night. Emma cooed softly, reaching for the last rays of sunlight, as if trying to capture the beauty before it faded. In a few months, there would be another child, a baby born from the connection between Marcus and Rachel, a physical manifestation of the new life they'd built together. The promise Marcus had made to Sarah seemed so distant now, so bound up in the specific moment of her dying, in the particular pain of loss. He'd kept it in spirit, if not in letter. He hadn't married quickly or impulsively, hadn't tried to replace Sarah with someone else, hadn't dishonored the love they'd shared. But he'd also learned that keeping a promise didn't mean freezing yourself in time. It meant understanding that the person who made you swear it would have wanted you to find your way forward. 1 month later, on a warm day in late May, the barn was officially complete. Marcus decided to host a celebration, not a grand event, just friends and neighbors gathering to admire the work and share a meal. Margaret came with her husband. James Harrison arrived with bottles of wine. Bill Henderson showed up with his family, his expression carrying an apology that Marcus didn't need but appreciated anyway. Frank Delgado brought his entire crew, and they stood around the barn talking about the craftsmanship with the particular pride that comes from creating something that will outlast you. Rachel circulated through the crowd with Emma on her hip, introducing her daughter to people who'd been skeptical of her just months earlier. Emma, now 6 months old and beginning to recognize faces and respond to voices, charmed everyone she encountered. It was remarkable how quickly people forgot their judgments when faced with an actual infant. The baby was innocent. The baby represented the future. The baby, somehow, made Rachel's presence seem less scandalous and more inevitable. As evening fell and the guests began to leave, Marcus stood on the porch of the new barn with his arm around Rachel. Emma was asleep against her shoulder, exhausted from the stimulation of so many new faces. Inside the barn, equipment hung neatly on hooks. The hayloft was full. Everything was ready for the next chapter. "Are you happy?" Rachel asked, looking at the property that had been transformed from a place of isolation and grief into something that felt alive. "Completely," Marcus said. "Are you?" "More than I thought was possible," Rachel said. She paused, then added, "I keep thinking about Sarah. About how different my life would have been if she hadn't gotten sick, if I'd known her earlier, if so many things had been different." "But then you wouldn't be here," Marcus said. "Emma wouldn't exist. The life we're building wouldn't exist." "I know," Rachel said, "and I'm grateful for that. But sometimes I feel guilty about being grateful, because her death is what made this possible." "Life is like that," Marcus said. "Tragedy and blessing are often the same event, seen from different angles. Sarah died, which was terrible, but because she died, I learned things about myself I never would have otherwise learned. And because I learned those things, I was able to be the person you needed when you arrived at my door. Sarah's death led to your life with Emma improving. That doesn't make her death good, but it makes something good come from something terrible." They stood in silence for a while, holding each other, holding Emma, holding the weight of all the decisions and chances and moments that had led them to this place. The next morning, Marcus woke early and went out to the barn. He stood in the center of the structure, listening to the early morning sounds, birds beginning their day, the grass moving in the breeze, the distant sound of a truck on a neighbor's property. He thought about all the mornings Sarah had woken up beside him, all the mornings after her death when he'd woken alone, all the mornings since Rachel had arrived, when he'd woken to the sound of Emma crying and the knowledge that his life contained purpose again. He walked to the far corner of the barn, where Frank had built a small memorial niche at Marcus's request. Marcus had placed a photograph there, the same photograph of Sarah that Margaret had given Rachel, but this copy was his own. Beside it, he'd placed a stone engraved with her dates and a single word, "Beloved." "Thank you," Marcus whispered to the photograph, "for the time we had, for the person I was with you, for loving me enough to want me to be happy even after you were gone." He didn't expect an answer, and none came. But standing there in the barn that had been rebuilt from ashes, Marcus felt something shift inside him. The grief was still there, it always would be, but it had transformed. It was no longer a weight that crushed him. It was a tender memory, a love that had changed him fundamentally, a relationship that continued to shape his choices even though Sarah was gone. When Marcus returned to the house, Rachel was in the kitchen with Emma, preparing breakfast. The baby was in her high chair, a recent addition, as Emma approached her ability to sit up on her own, and Rachel was spooning small tastes of cereal into Emma's mouth while humming the same lullaby she'd sung on that first night. "Good morning," Rachel said, smiling at him in a way that suggested she understood what he'd been doing out at the barn. "Your daughter is learning to eat solids." "Our daughter," Marcus corrected, and the words felt right in a way that nothing had felt right in a long time. He pulled up a chair and sat beside them, watching Emma work through the mystery of eating, her tiny hands reaching for the spoon, her face covered in cereal dust and determination. This was his life now. This was the future he'd thought was impossible, a home that was lived in rather than preserved, a family that was building rather than mourning, a love that acknowledged the past while embracing the present. Outside, the Nebraska sun was rising higher in the sky, warming the fields and the new barn and the house that had been transformed from a tomb into a home. Spring was becoming summer. Emma would grow. The baby would arrive. Life would continue to happen, moment by moment, building toward a future that none of them could quite imagine, but all of them were creating together. Marcus Webb, who'd promised his dying wife he wouldn't marry again, had found himself keeping that promise by breaking it. He'd honored Sarah's memory not by freezing time, but by allowing himself to move forward. And in doing so, he'd discovered that love wasn't a finite resource, that the heart had more room than grief had taught him to believe, and that sometimes the most profound promises we make are the ones we have to break in order to keep them in spirit. The barn stood strong in the morning light, a monument to rebuilding, to redemption, to the particular kind of courage it takes to let go of one life and embrace another. And inside the house, a man and a woman and a baby had found their way home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.